My name is Noelle Chorney, and I'm the managing editor of the Gardener magazine. I come from a very long line of gardening people on my ancestry. Everyone gardens, and I grew up gardening, and I also have a passion for food. So I cook it, I eat it, I grow it, I choose where I travel because of it, and I preserve it. So today I wanted to talk about strategic food preservation and preserving what you grow in your garden. And I'm not going to get into the science of a lot of it. You can look up a lot of that online. And canning, and as far as safety practices and those kinds of things, canning supply companies are very clear about safe practices. I follow all of those, and I urge you to do the same. I just want to while I'm here, I want to inspire members of the audience to think about preserving food in a way that is strategic and creative and realistic. There's no point in setting yourself up to fail when you're growing food and trying to preserve it by overextending yourself and exhausting yourself in the process. I would much prefer everyone take a sustainable approach to preserving food in your garden and avoid burnout and increase the food or the enjoyment of the food that you grow. So there are so many ways to preserve food, and I really want everyone to think about what works best for them. So to just get the definition out of the way, what we're talking about today, to preserve food means that we're preventing the growth of bacteria, fungi such as yeast, or microorganisms, both good and bad, that can cause rot. Food preservation may also include processes that inhibit deterioration and stopping things like browning reactions, for example, in apples after they're cut. So what we're going to talk about today is strategic food preservation. So we're going to think strategically about making the most of your garden produce. We're going to be realistic about your available time and interest and give you some of those options. And consider all the available methods of food preservation, from the least amount of effort to the most amount of effort. Gardening in modern times is challenging. It's a lot of work, and many of us love it and do it because we love it. And food preservation extends your garden produce, but it also extends the work. And your time is precious. So most importantly, be strategic about what you choose to do. And when we talk about being strategic, and what we'll cover today is knowing why you're preserving, choosing what you choose to preserve, knowing where you will store it so you don't run out of space, and how you will preserve it based on your answers to the why, what, and where. My own personal strategic goal is to use the least amount of effort for the greatest possible outcome. And after years of practice, I have some suggestions based on what works for me. And I really want to stress that it needs to work for you. And I am a busy mom. I do like to grow things. Some things grow better than others for me. I also really love to eat things, but I also have 2 refrigerators in the winter and 3 refrigerators in the summer. And so I make a lot of use of my freezer space and my refrigerator space, which not everyone has. So we have to kind of think of all of those things when we're organizing, choosing what we're going to preserve. So what I recommend as far as balancing effort and outcome is to plan to plant only what you enjoy eating, what you can enjoy at its peak, or that you can realistically preserve in a convenient way that yields enjoyable results. And I know what many people are thinking. Any gardener that's right now is thinking, you're asking me in March to try to be realistic about what I'm going to plant, because that's not how gardeners work when they have the seed catalogs in front of them, and I am also guilty of that. I understand it's easier said than done. So when you're ordering your seeds in the dead of winter, you're probably thinking green and growing things, warm days, fresh vegetables, and you're probably not thinking about the hours spent in a hot kitchen in August and September until 1 in the morning trying to process all the vegetables and fruits that you just picked. I recommend taking the long view to maximize both efficiency and enjoyment. So I was talking about the why, what, where. Let's first talk about the why. Why are you preserving? Is it for waste prevention? Is it for nostalgia because your grandmother and your mother did and you have these favorite recipes that you use? Is it for nutrition because you want to maximize the quality fresh vegetables that you can pick from your garden because they can't get fresher than that? Is it about eating local? Is it about saving money? Or is it about sharing and gifting? Ask yourself what will you use within the next year or two? And then ask yourself, is that really what I will use within the next year or two? When my grandmother moved into a retirement home, I got all of her canned goods that were in their basement for who knows how long. I do know that there were some things that were at least 10 years old that I was given, jams and jellies and pickles, and we weren't able to use a lot of them, and I was aware, having done canning myself, how much effort and time went into that, and I really don't want anyone to waste their time or the produce that they're growing. So I just recommend thinking about not unless you're going to give it away, which is perfectly valid. Try to limit the amount of what you're preserving. So regarding choosing what you're going to preserve, there are some questions you can ask yourself. What do you like? What do you grow best? And are you selecting plants and seed varieties that are best for freezing and canning if that's what you're going to if that's what you're trying to do with them, and what will you actually use? And once again, I recommend being realistic. In my own gardens, there are things that don't grow well, and we found that what we really grow well are carrots and Swiss chard, and beets, and green beans, and tomatoes. So we kind of go all in on those things because we know that they freeze well and that we have ways that we like to preserve them, and we have space to do so. And that's in a very limited garden space. We have a small plots that we're working with. And yours will be different. There might be things that your family loves or hates, and there might be things that you really love the frozen version of, and other things that you really don't. And you can decide all of those things based on your own needs. So the next question is, where do you have to store things? So do you have a pantry and cold room space? Is there counter space that you can put things on as far as pickles or fermenting, for things that you're fermenting? Do you have refrigerator space for things that can be stored in the refrigerator? And do you have freezer space? I have to be fairly strategic about my freezer space, and at certain times of year when it gets cold, I am often using my outdoor freezer, which is the whole great outdoors in coolers in my backyard, which some people are going to be more comfortable than that, or comfortable about that than others. So remember this. There is more to food preservation than just canning. So using all of your resources, and my own personal philosophy is what I call the ABC approach, which is anything but canning. And canning can be, I do can, but canning is my last resort. So when we're talking about the ingredients that we would use for food preservation, and we'll look at all of them and see how we can put them to work for you. So the basics are in various forms: salt, sugar, acid, heat, cold, and moisture, and multiple combinations of those. And preservation methods to consider are freezing, fermenting, drying, macerating, and canning. So I'm going to go through the pros and cons of all of those different approaches, and what things work best in my experience for each of those approaches. So the pros, of freezing is we lock in flavor and nutrition at the height of your food's freshness. It requires very few tools, and it's easy to learn. It does require electricity for storage, and it also requires freezer space. There are methods that don't require any tools whatsoever, and then there are methods that require some of the items that I have here. So, one approach to freezing is just throw your clean fruit or vegetables into the freezer in a bag or a container. And the things that work best for that are berries, which you can freeze individually. Sometimes I lay them out on a big pan and let them freeze solid so that I can pull them out. They don't all clump together. Grated carrots or zucchini in the size in a container or bag in a serving size so that you can drop them into muffins or soups. Whole tomatoes with the skins taken off, and the tomatoes you just drop into boiling water for a minute to slip the skins off. And also smoothie ingredients like bananas, which obviously we don't grow here, but they often end up in my freezer, alongside leafy greens and trimmings from various green things to go into smoothies. So you don't need to do anything except put those things in the freezer. There are other fruits that will brown quite easily if you put them in the freezer without treating them at least a little bit. So things like peaches and apples can be tossed in lemon juice and water, or fruit fresh and water, and those can just go sliced into the freezer. With pie filling, if you are a maker of pies, you can make the pie filling right up and then put it in the freezer, or you can just prepare the fruit and use it for whatever to make the pie filling when it comes out and is thawed, which is generally my approach because sometimes I don't know what I want to do with them and I want to leave things as flexible as possible. Then there are pureeing and freezing items. So that can be fresh basil. You just put basil and just enough olive oil to make a paste and add some salt and freeze it in ice cube trays. That basically works the same as fresh basil in soups and stews and those kinds of things. Then there's blanching, which is where some of this equipment comes in. This is something that I inherited from my grandmother, and this is a blancher, which you drop into boiling water, put your vegetables in there, drop it into boiling water for just a few minutes, and then chill them and freeze them directly. I grew up with a huge blanching and freezing process, and my mom used to freeze all of the things: peas, beans, carrots, chard, spinach, broccoli, cauliflower, corn, all of those things. So I liked, which they were always just frozen into little bags when I was growing up, but now I freeze my beans individually, spread them out on a tray so that I can grab a handful and take as many or as few as I want. They don't last as long that way, but I'm always aiming to only have enough to last me the winter and then grow more. I have some other approaches that I have worked out over the years, some of which are to make a soup base and then freeze that, but then you can turn it into whatever you want. So chopped beets and broad beans and peas and everything cooked together so that it's tender, but then you can add water and extend it when it comes out of the freezer. I've also made a corn chowder base with zucchini and potatoes and corn and red peppers, and then you can add cream when it comes out. You can have it on its own, add cheese and bacon, so that you can be as flexible as you want. And basically how I learned those things or came up with them was to just Google, I have corn and peppers and potatoes. Is there some kind of chowder I can make that I could freeze? And there are lots and lots of resources out there. So one of my favorites, ways of doing preservation is to roast it and then freeze it, of course, if you have the room. So lots of people can their tomatoes and can salsas. I don't. I have done, and I can tell you a story about a fall where my mom, who does canned tomatoes, was going on a road trip and handed me off all of her tomatoes and cans and everything and asked me to do the canning of the tomatoes as they came ripe. for her so she didn't lose out on them. Meanwhile, I was doing slow roasted tomatoes for my tomatoes and packing them into the freezer. So I had 1 year of experience doing both. And the mess and the time that it took to do the canning and the processing compared to my take a big tray, and I've shared a picture of my tray of fresh tomatoes going into the oven to be reduced, and you just put them in the oven at 300 or 325 for an hour or so until they're nice and reduced. Put those in the freezer and pull them out and use them as canned tomatoes. You can add a little more water, but they're delicious and it's zero effort and zero mess. So I also roast my salsas and freeze the salsas instead of canning them. So that's my preference, just because, and it works really well for how we use it. It really depends on your traditions, and sometimes there are some of those traditions you can let go of. I also really like to take our Halloween pumpkins after they've been carved and then roast the pumpkin and strain off some of the, just let them sit and drip off some of the liquid, and use that puree out of the freezer for pies and muffins. So that's basically the freezing, all the freezing options. I'd like to move on to the methods involving salt, which is related to also called lactic acid fermentation. There may be other, you can give a whole presentation on just lactic acid fermentation, so this is a very light touch at this point. But it is one that is an alternative to canning, so I'm going to talk about it here a little bit. So the pros of lactic acid fermentation is that it uses salt to stop the bad bacteria from growing and enhance feed the good bacteria that changes the vegetables into something that will last a lot longer. So it creates probiotics. Those good bacteria are probiotics, which are really good for you on their own and also make the other nutrients in the vegetables easier to digest. It also requires minimal equipment. You can invest in lots of equipment for fermenting, but I don't do much of that. I guess I do have a crock that I inherited, but other than that, I just go with regular jars, although I do have there are some special jars like this one that clips on that has some of my salted herbs in it. So the cons of fermenting are that the shelf life is more limited than your traditional canning, and you actually need to keep them in the refrigerator or cold storage once they're fermented in order to keep them. So the methods that you can use for that is simply to add salt. Non-iodized salt is best, pure canning salt or kosher salt. Salt that is as unprocessed as possible. So you can just simply use salt. Salted herbs is one of my go-tos that I make every single year. And it is basically just fresh herbs and other, some carrots and onions mixed with a certain amount of salt and left in the fridge and then packed in jars. And you can use them they last more than a year. I try to only make enough to last me a year, but they have lasted a little longer. Sauerkraut is also just cabbage mixed with salt, onion as well. Kimchi, which is the Korean version of sauerkraut, are just using salt. We also have like a salt and water brine, which is 2 to 3 tablespoons of water per liter. And you can make kosher pickles, beans, beets, zucchini pickles, mixed veggies. Sometimes you can add a little bit of yogurt whey to it if you need to kind of give it a boost, but most of the time fresh vegetables out of the garden have enough natural bacteria in them to get them started with just salt water. So yeah, fermentation I'm a huge fan of. I've shared a few pictures of some of the fermented pickles that I have going. I've done beets. It can be different colored beets. I add herbs to them. I do kosher pickles. I've made fermented relishes. Most of the things that you can. I've also made fermented hot sauce. It's really fun and really delicious, and it feels really good because it's super fresh stuff and really good for you as well, as long as you can handle a little extra salt in your diet. So moving on to other methods, we also have moisture-related methods, either adding liquid or taking away liquid. So dehydrating herbs, fruits, and berries, either in a dehydrator or in a low oven for the fruits and berries. There are great drying racks that you can get for herbs. I have a hanging drying rack that I dry various herbal things in my basement. So that's another way to just keep tea elements, rose petals, rose hips, all those kinds of things for use throughout the year. Then we have all the methods that are related to adding sugar. So this is, classic canned peaches, jams, jellies, all of those kinds of things. It preserves the color and flavor really beautifully. It doesn't take a lot of equipment when if you're not pressure canning, and they have a super long shelf life. The cons are it's not super good for you to have a lot of sugar, and there can be a bit of a drawback for effort and mess. I have to say that when there are things that I know are worth it, and I only use it, we aren't a big jam eating family, but when I get some prairie grown grapes, I will turn them into grape jelly, which is something that I did do this year because I know that everyone loves it. It's a great gift at Christmas, and it's such a beautiful, rich flavor. But I only make a jam or jelly every couple years, and that lasts us for my family. So I also make liqueurs, and that was one of I think I've written articles on that as well. Basically just adding 2 parts fruit of any kind, basically sour cherries, black currants, Saskatoon berries, 1 part vodka or brandy and 1 part sugar, and just mix them all together and macerate for several weeks and then drain and bottle, and it's one of the most delicious things. I'm sharing here a picture of I did a plum and basil liqueur because I tasted one once somewhere and went, oh, I grow those. I came across some local plums and turned it into a plum and basil liqueur, and so I'm sharing an image of that of the liqueur in process. So of course you can make syrup, jams, and jellies. I often make choke cherry syrup when we have a lot of choke cherries. And sometimes you try to make jelly and you end up with syrup, which is also okay because it tastes great on pancakes. Also, herb jellies are a good way of preserving your herbs if you use them, because those are something that lots of people don't know how to use. And but they are really beautiful gifts, and if you have the time and the herbs overflowing, you can certainly do that. Canning can be worth the effort, and I've talked about sometimes when it is and sometimes when it isn't. It just requires a little bit of equipment and a little bit of technique. So, of course, there's the acid canning, where we have enough vinegar in the canning to preserve it for a long time. The pros are that they have a very long shelf life. They're really great to give as gifts. I swear that my mother, who makes great pickles, uses them as currency. Everyone lives for her pickles. And it also requires no electricity for storage, so you can put them on a shelf somewhere and leave them for a couple of years and have them access them when you need them. So some of the cons are that it does require some equipment and some effort. When you have to can things for a long period of time, you do reduce the nutrition of the vegetables that you're canning because you have to heat process them. and it does require the right acid content to store them safely. So they can be a little bit tricky. So traditional canning items are all kinds of pickles, relishes, chutneys, tomatoes, other vegetables. Because I still get the pickles from my mom and I really like the fermented pickles, I don't do pickles, but I do use some cucumbers to make cucumber relish every year because we really enjoy the sweet relish. So I would say that I was talking about strategic approaches to this, and there are things that I have gone, yes, it is worth it. And sometimes though, I ask myself, do I really need to heat process this? Because you can also do a quick pickle, and if you're going to, like a refrigerator pickle, you don't have to put that in, do the processing and the canning if you're going to just keep it in the fridge for a few weeks and use it up. If you have just a small surplus, you can do a quick pickle and keep it in the fridge and not worry about the rest of the steps. Freezer jam is something that people like to do as well. I just want to make sure everyone isn't daunted by the idea of canning, and I have my big canner here. I don't have a pressure canner, but when I'm canning things like the relish, they get boiled in the water for 20 minutes to seal them and preserve them. But there are very few situations where going all that way is required, and unless you know that you love them and you're willing to commit, there are lots of other ways to preserve things. So there are tons of options. So when you're a new gardener and you're thinking about all the commitments that go along with gardening, or you haven't thought about all the commitments that go along with gardening, and suddenly you have all of this produce and you don't know what to do with it, just give yourself a little bit of space to think about what really will work for you, because I know I came out of a family that canning was the thing that was done, and it is a great tool to know how to do and a great skill to have, and it isn't something that you should do. It is one option out of many options, and I really encourage everyone to grow what you're good at, grow what you like, and save just enough in whatever way makes sense to you. Thanks so much.